everyone, welcome back to another Audio Tools Explained. Today we're going to be going over something much less complex than the compression videos we have been going over the past few Audio Tools Explained videos. And we're going to be going over something much more simpler to use, but still somewhat intricate when you start to implement it into your audio processing. And that is distortion. Now, distortion in and of itself is a very simple tool once you get into learning how it works and learning what it's doing. Most of the distortion plugins that are available today are modeled or attempt to be modeled after what would happen when an electrical signal in the analog world that is conveying an audio signal would be distorted when put through specific hardware units that would color the sound in certain ways. The most common way that audio signal is distorted, both in the modeled digital world and in the analog world, would be through what we would refer to as clipping, where the electrical signal that is transmitting the audio information is actually boosted so that the hardware that it's being run through is actually carrying an audio signal that is too strong or above its max rating. And what this would generally do is it would color the sound or distort the sound and change its dynamic range, and it would, in essence, add in a more pleasing tone in most cases. Now, clipping is the most common form of distortion and is what is modeled in a variety of new plugins that are on the market and available in your DAWs today as stock plugins. There's also another form of distortion which is much more aggressive called truncation distortion. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. Now, essentially what truncation distortion is instead of running it through a hardware unit or modeling running it through a hardware unit in the digital world, what this does is it instead lowers the bit rate or bit depth of the audio signal and lowers it down to a point where it really distorts the sound, and you start to get into bit depths of 8-bit, 4-bit, 12-bit, that kind of range, and it really brings the audio down and starts distorting it. Currently, most music or audio that you'll find on YouTube, on Spotify, or any other platform will either be 16 or 24-bit. There is such a thing as 32-bit audio. However, it is not as commonly found, as in most cases, you cannot audibly tell the difference between 24 or 32-bit audio. And even then again, in a lot of cases, it is difficult to tell the difference between 16 and 24-bit audio, as the representation in the digital world of the audio signal using those higher bit rates is very hard to distinguish in a lot of cases unless you have a very well-trained ear. However, sometimes you want to model a loss in bit depth in your audio signal to add this unique kind of distortion. Kind of brings you back to the earlier days when the original Pokemons were released. It's that kind of soundtrack kind of vibe. It really gives you the 8-bit kind of sound in really anything you use it through. However, it is very difficult to use, as the distortion in a lot of cases with truncation distortion is very unpleasant. Today we're going to be going over, for the most part, just standard clipping distortion, as this is the most common one that's found. So I have this session built up here, and I'm going to be modeling this for the most part on the guitar track on the very top, which I'll solo for you guys, as guitar is one of those instruments that just takes distortion and all that kind of over-the-top post-processing very well. So I have my stock plugin for my DAW here right in the middle, and over on the right you see I have this plugin called Fabfilter Saturn 2. I mentioned a couple Fabfilter plugins in my earlier videos. They are really great plugins. You don't necessarily need these plugins. They are a great resource, but you can do a lot of what these plugins can do with other stock plugins or other free plugins. It's just a lot harder. I personally prefer using the Fabfilter plugins because they're easy to use and they have a lot of creative options. But we're going to start off with demonstrating this with our just standard stock plugin, because that will be offering the best general overview of what distortion does. Like I said, this is all very simple. So what this particular unit does is something called sine wave distortion. And what this does is it models the clipping of a hardware unit this is not modeling any sort of specific hardware unit, it's just modeling the general process. A lot of distortion units out there will actually be modeled after specific hardware units, such as compressors or hardware distortion units. However, this is not the case for this particular stock plugin. So let's just listen to our original guitar before we get into adding the distortion to it and hearing what this is doing to our sound. We've got a very, very funky guitar to play with. And some would say it already has an amazing sound depending on the music genre you're trying to use it in. However, let's just say for the sake of example and for learning, we really want to distort the hell out of this. I'm going to leave my mix at 100% and we'll explain the spatial one later. Our output knob is just a general boost or dip in output volume, so that's not really anything special. And we also have a tone knob here, which is just another and basically what this tone knob does is it's just another unit used to control the tone of the distortion that it's producing. However, the main knobs to focus on for most, if not all, distortion units will be your boost or drive knob. In this particular plugin, it's labeled boost. And for the more creative people, the feedback knob. So we're going to start boosting the audio signal through the distortion unit. And basically, the more we boost it, the more it is modeling the hardware clip and clipping the audio and distorting it and giving it either extra harmonics if it has some sort of saturation alongside the distortion, or extremely compressing it and really, really adding in a lot of bite. So I'm going to start at 0 and we're just going to turn it up slowly and we'll see how it sounds. So you can very audibly hear the extreme difference, even when I was just barely adding it in, that it's having to our guitar. It's making it sound very, very distorted and very reminiscent of a more electric distorted guitar, such as you would get from a guitar amp, or that you might hear in some of the more recent, or that you might hear in a lot of rock music today. And it's a very, very fast difference, as you can hear. Not all distortion units will have a tone modifier. However, some of them will. And generally what it does is just changes the overall tone of the distortion. Right now we have the mix at 100% and we have it boosted up enough that we're getting a decent amount of distortion. I'm going to put our tone all the way down to 0 and we'll play around with it a little bit too so we can hear what it's doing. You can hear, as I had the tone all the way down at 0, there wasn't a lot of high end to our distortion. It almost sounded like it had a sort of high end cut. However, as we put the tone up higher and higher, we got more of that high end brightness. It got a lot brighter as we turned it up. And it really, really brought out the presence of the guitar that we're working with. This might not be the case for all distortion tone knobs out there. As always, play around with your plugins that you're using specifically and use your ears to hear what they're doing. And more often than not, you will find similar functions on each plugin for each category. Now we're going to put it back to its stock default setting, which was around 8. And we're going to play around with this feedback knob. This is one that is very, very common on any distortion plugin unit out there. And more often than not, it is used to get a more creative sound. Generally, generally what a feedback knob does is it loops the sound back through and creates this new sort of feedback looped audio that really, really adds new... normally what a feedback knob will do is it'll take the output Normally what the feedback knob will do is it'll take the output audio for the signal that just went through the unit and it'll loop it back around and put it back in. And it will process it again in a sense. However, this will also create something called a feedback loop effect, which will probably be demonstrated in this plugin here. So let's play around with our feedback a little bit and hear what it does to our sound. As you can hear, it got a lot more distorted as we added in more feedback. And this is because it was taking the output signal, which was already distorted, and looping some of it back in and distorting it again. Now, this feedback function is unique for some audio processing units. We're going to dive into what the Saturn has for its functions, and it's very, very, very similar. On our stock distortion unit, we had our distortion labeled as boost. In our third-party plugin from Fabfilter, it's labeled as drive. We also have our mix and feedback function here. As you can see, it doesn't have a tone knob. However, it does have this sort of 4-band EQ on the right for bass, mids, treble, and presence EQing. And it also has just our regular output level. Very, very, very similar. Distortion plugins are very, very similar and very, very simple once you get to know them. Now, as opposed to our stock version, which only had our one sort of sine wave distortion here, Fabfilter Saturn is actually modeled after hardware units. It has tubes, tape, guitar amps, and then it has more unique and very much more aggressive distortion techniques. Techniques such as rectify are part of that truncation distortion I mentioned earlier, where it'll actually take your bit depth and reduce it and really, really crunch up your audio, which you can hear if I just play around with it a little bit on this guitar. As you can see, I'm putting it through with absolutely zero drive, and it's still absolutely wrecking our audio. So we're not going to go with that example today. However, we'll go with something more in the tube. We'll put in some tube distortion, and we'll hear the difference as opposed to the just regular sine distortion of the other plugin that we were playing with. So that's our tube, and we also have our tape distortion. We'll try hearing what the tape sounds like as well. As you can see, our sort of tape distortion that we have on currently isn't necessarily as aggressive as the tube distortion we had on beforehand. So it's really, really important to listen to your distortion units and play around, because one distortion unit or one type of distortion may work great for one thing. However, it may not work great for everything in your audio production or everything in your mix at the end of the day. So always play around with your plugins and use your ears. Now, as I mentioned with our stock plugin here, it has our sort of feedback knob on the left, and we heard what that was doing to our audio. The feedback function for Fabfilter Saturn is slightly different, as it's actually feedbacking a certain frequency, and it creates more unique sounds. You can hear how that can already be used very creatively to create some very, very interesting sounds, both in music and in terms of just general sound design or audio creative scenarios. And you can hear how it is vastly different from the distortion feedback of our stock plugin. Now, we've been playing a lot around with this guitar here, and that's because guitar generally takes distortion very, very well. It's something that can be very, very easily distorted. But let's see what happens when we put it on something else, such as bass, drums, or these strings that I have down below, or even this brass. Now, bass can be a very, very fun one to distort, because generally, when you're adding bass into your mix or a bass guitar, you have a lot of low end. However, something that can really, really make your bass stand out is distorting it so that the high end is just a little bit more present. Right now we have this just simple electric bass with no distortion. However, we can add some distortion in to both give it some more interest and make it more present in our mix by adding in some additional high end, or bringing the high end that's currently there out more. With the current distortion, we have this sort of warm tape. It sounds almost like it's coming through a bass amp, which is very, very great if you want to model a sort of band-style electric bass. However, we can also put it through some tube and see how that modifies our sound. So overall, distortion is very, very simple for what it does to your audio. However, since distortion is in most cases modeled after something called hardware clipping, where it actually clips the top of your audio off, distortion has a side effect of compressing your audio, in most cases, to the extremes and can reduce the dynamic range. So that's something you need to be aware of as you're adding distortion in. It's not something you need to be necessarily aware of when designing the sound of your instruments, and more of something you need to be aware of if you're applying distortion to instrument groups or your master track in general, which is a very, very good tip if you want to add just some warmth to your final production. However, you need to be aware that you are clipping off that top end of your dynamic range and reducing the dynamic range a little bit when you run it through distortion plugins. Now, both the guitar and bass take distortion very, very well. Something I personally use distortion a lot for is for my strings and my brass section when I'm writing my orchestral songs. So what I'll do is, for example, on the brass, I always find that the brass is missing a little bit of high and high mid crisp, and I'll add this back in by both using some EQing and a little bit of distortion to give the brass a bit more of a analog recording feel. So we have our stock brass sound here. However, we can add some distortion in to give it a bit more of a warmer and crisper sound. Now, as you can hear, when I'm adding this distortion in, even around 30 to 50%, you get that sort of crunch or that sort of distortion that's not pleasant when you would be implementing that into your final mix. And here's what I'm going to cover: how to implement your distortion plugins to actually give you a pleasing sound. When you're playing with your drive and you start to hear the distortion, that's generally where you want to leave the drive, unless you want to go crazy and go further beyond that. However, for me personally, when I'm mixing orchestral sections such as brass or strings, you don't necessarily want that sort of rock distortion, which you'll get from pretty much any distortion plugin. So you'll actually take the mix and you'll turn it down, and this will add what you want into the original audio, as well as eliminating any of the harmful audible byproducts. We'll just bypass this, and it will be a very slight difference when we turn this compressor back on, but you will hear an audible difference and hopefully an audible improvement to the audio. So it's a very, very slight difference, but hopefully you can hear it. It added a bit more of a high-end detail, very, very slight. Normally I'd compensate for the current darkness by just adding in a little bit of EQ afterwards and boosting it. It also sort of eliminated our dynamic range a little bit, which is one of those things you have to be careful of. A really, really good mixing tip that I often do with a lot of things is parallel distortion. However, We're going to hop into parallel effects in another video, but generally what this is you send your signal to a different track and distort that other track 100% and then blend that track in. It's very similar to what a mix knob would do. However, it gives you more control in your mix. And one thing that I know for sure that a lot of mixers out there do is they will add just the slightest amount of distortion on their master track as well as their mixing buses, because this will bring your audio together. It will add a bit more of color to your track. Perhaps people are looking for that analog warmth that you'd get with using an actual hardware console. Distortion is great for that. Or perhaps they're looking to just control the dynamic range, or perhaps they just wanted a slightly more distorted sound. However, in most cases, distortion is one of those things you want to blend in very, very lightly, depending on the type of distortion as well. As always, different types of distortion will distort different amounts. They'll either be less aggressive or very, very aggressive or somewhere in between. So it's always good to just pay attention to how much your audio signal is being distorted and use the appropriate plugin for the appropriate sound of what you're trying to get in your final production. That's pretty much it for distortion plugins. They're very, very simple at the end of the day. It's pretty much 2 or 3 knobs at most. I hope you... it's pretty much 2 or 3 knobs at most. I hope you guys found this informative, and I hope you're looking forward to next week because we have a very, very interesting audio recreation coming next week, and I know you guys will enjoy it. So stick around, stay tuned for next Wednesday, and as always, I will see you guys next time. Have a good one.